Iran is about to give an answer that could change the course of the crisis in the Middle East. The proposal sent by the United States seeks to open a negotiated way out, but it also demands deep concessions regarding Iran's nuclear program, its missile capabilities, and the future of the Strait of Hormuz. Expectations are extremely high because, at this moment, a single decision could either open the door to emergency negotiations or push the war into a harsher, more costly, and far more dangerous phase for the entire region. The American offer arrives in an explosive context. Washington insists that there is still room for diplomacy, but at the same time it maintains intense military pressure and claims it can achieve its objectives without resorting to a large-scale ground invasion. The White House's strategy appears clear. Negotiate from a position of strength while leaving open the possibility of continuing to weaken Iran's military capacity if Tehran decides to reject the plan. That message has been repeated by senior officials of the United States, who argue that the campaign could be concluded in weeks, not necessarily months. However, from the Iranian side, the proposal is not seen as a balanced invitation, but as a document filled with demands that would force the country to give up much of its defensive capacity in exchange for promises it considers ambiguous. The reading inside Tehran is that the plan mainly favors Washington and its allies, and that accepting those terms without changes would amount to surrendering on issues considered strategic for its military and political survival. Even so, the door to diplomacy has not been completely closed, and that is precisely what keeps the world watching every signal coming out of the Iranian capital with such tension. One of the most delicate points in the document is the issue of the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a minor detail or a secondary clause. That maritime corridor is one of the most sensitive energy arteries on the planet, and nearly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas passes through it. That is why any attempt to change who controls the conditions of transit through that zone carries enormous weight. The United States and several powers want to guarantee safe navigation without tolls, while within the Iranian sphere the idea has emerged that passage would not be completely free for everyone once the war is over. That possibility alone is already setting off alarms in Asia, Europe, and the Gulf. The concern is not only commercial. The Strait of Hormuz has become an instrument of power. Whoever manages to impose conditions, they will have a tool capable of affecting fuel prices, maritime transport, fertilizers, production costs, and global supply chains. That is one of the reasons why Gulf countries are pressing Washington so strongly to ensure that any eventual agreement does not merely stop the bombings, but also genuinely reduces Iran's ability to threaten energy routes and civilian targets in the region. For those governments, returning to a fragile balance would only plant the seeds of the next crisis. But the most troubling element is that Iran's capacity to respond is still far from gone. Sources in the United States acknowledge that only part of Iran's arsenal has been destroyed with certainty. Another portion may be damaged or buried in underground facilities, while an additional segment could still remain active. That means if Iran rejects the proposal harshly, it still retains the means to respond through missiles, drones, or indirect actions against American, Israeli, or neighboring regional interests. In other words, an Iranian refusal would not be merely a political gesture. It could come with a new military shock. That calculation explains why Iran's response is being treated as a decisive moment. For Washington, a yes would open immediate talks and allow it to present military pressure as effective. For Iran, accepting without modifications could be seen internally as a sign of weakness. And for the rest of the world, both scenarios carry risks. A rushed negotiation could break down quickly if the opening conditions are too harsh. A total rejection, on the other hand, could lead to an expansion of attacks, greater military mobilization, and new reprisals on multiple fronts. The margin for error is minimal, and every actor knows it. Meanwhile, international pressure continues to grow. The foreign ministers of the Group of Seven have demanded a halt to attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and they have also called for the restoration of safe navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. That position reflects the fact that the crisis is no longer seen as an isolated regional clash. The fear now is that the conflict could more deeply disrupt the global economy and increase the vulnerability of countries that are not even directly involved in the war. When the major powers start talking about impacts on energy, fertilizers, and commercial supply chains. The message is that the crisis is already being felt far beyond the battlefield. At the same time, even within the Western Bloc, signs of discomfort have emerged over exactly where this war is heading. In Europe, there are doubts about the clarity of the final objectives and about how the conflict could be brought to an end without leaving the region even more unstable. That uncertainty matters because it reveals that, although several allies share concern about Iran, not all of them have the same confidence in the path chosen by Washington and Israel. The longer that lack of clarity continues, the harder it becomes to sustain a common strategy, and the more room there is for contradictory diplomatic pressure. At its core, the central question is not only how Iran will respond, but how each actor will interpret that response. A partial acceptance could be read by the United States as an opportunity to launch rapid talks, while Tehran would present it as a defense of its red lines. A qualified rejection might not completely close the door to diplomacy, but it would harden the military language, and a full rejection would have the potential to trigger a new cycle of bombings, regional reprisals, and panic in energy markets. That is why this response matters so much. It will not be just a statement, but a signal of whether the crisis is entering a tense pause or a much more violent phase. There is another factor that makes this waiting period even more unsettling. The war has already caused human and political damage that makes any concession far more difficult. Allegations of attacks on civilians, pressure within international institutions, and accumulated outrage across the region all increase the cost of sitting down to negotiate. The higher the symbolic and human cost of the conflict, the more difficult it becomes for either side to sell an agreement without appearing to retreat. In situations like this, military calculations are not the only thing that matter. Pride, internal narratives, and the need to project strength to allies and adversaries matter as well. At the same time, other actors are moving around the crisis and trying to influence the outcome. Russia and several regional mediators have held talks about a possible political exit, while Turkey, Pakistan, and other governments are trying to prevent the confrontation from fully closing the door to diplomacy. That underground movement of context shows that no one underestimates the danger. When so many capitals intervene at the same time, it is not because the war is under control, but because there's real fear that a single wrong decision could drag in more countries and multiply the consequences. Additional deployment of troops from the United States also plays a role. Although Washington insists it is not seeking a ground invasion, that reinforcement broadens its options in the face of any unexpected turn and fuels Iranian suspicion that diplomatic pressure could come hand in hand with further offensives. The dominant feeling is that the clock is moving faster than diplomacy. Iran faces a decision that could redefine its military position, its political room to maneuver, and its relationship with an entire region that is already watching every new move with fear. The United States, meanwhile, is pressing for strategic concessions without fully halting the use of force. In the middle are the markets, the energy routes, the neighboring countries, and millions of people who know that when a crisis reaches this point, any miscalculated response can ignite something far larger. If the proposal opens the door to real negotiations, the world will breathe for a moment. If it fails, the next headline may not be about a peace offer, but about an escalation that no one can contain.